specifically, who has been the visible figure in the organization of this event. We are very glad to be here. And we want to thank you for your interest in land management and land registries. Cadastres are a very important topic and have been for the last 20 years. I started to work with this since I was a child. I have other passions also, but cadastres are a whole issue. They're in institutions, depending on how you see, or their databases, if you see it in a different perspective. And in Latin America, it's been so for the last 15 years. You see there's common problems. Some of the solutions can be common too. And in the last 3 years, at least, in our lives, we've seen the 3D vision for these purposes, and you will see that this is more extensive than you can imagine. We're not going to talk about geometry, but urban economy and rights. Talking about space, not only representation, spatial representation. And we wonder, well, is it 3D or should we stick to 2D? Then Lincoln Institute is working on a series of topics related to cadastres. As the name of the institute says, it's land policies, but without the appropriate cadastre, we cannot develop urban policies that are consistent with the reality. And when I say cadastre base, I do not mean the mapping of plots or the simple blueprint, but the economic basis as well, and the relationship that people have with the land through their property, through possession, through the occupation, invasions. So many types of tenures that we have. So this is extremely diverse, as you know, and it has a lot of inequalities. The concentration of land in this geographical area of the planet is a more unequal. Because of the distribution in very few hands and the lack of the appropriate cadastre that registers who are the actual owners and how much this land is worth, and the economics and politics behind such a technical thing and such a boring thing that may be a cadastre. So when you see this word, you imagine, I don't know, yellowish maps that are registered somewhere and out-to-date sheets, and many others may imagine that I'm going to show many digital maps or information services online. No, this is going to be more about philosophy, about how we position ourselves in front of this information. It's transparency and where we can get to in 4 or 5 years. The first question is, if it is difficult to have a 2D cadastre, is it important to consider a 3D cadastre? I think it's worth it because it can reduce urban informality that in Latin American cities is 50% in average. So surveys show that half of each Latin America city is informal or irregular because it doesn't respect the codes because of many other imperfections. And no matter where you see it, the interesting thing is that this informality is not in a map. You see a picture, you see the informal picture in Google, but what people need is to be in the maps. And it's not the same. This formal and efficient acknowledgement of administration is achieved through maps. So as I said before, these 2D cadastres will, of course, imply great efforts in the following years, and we can start to visualize them in a different way, sending them or looking from the side instead of only from the top. So this change of site, I would like to depict it with this image that we have on screen. It comes from a Brazilian artist. It's a view that each one of us has of the city. Every one of us will see a different thing. An economist will not see the same city than an architect, than an engineer, than an ecologist, a sociologist, an anthropologist. And we need to model this cadastre is the urban model or the geographic model that is created with more detail for geographic analysis. It's a greater scale than there may be there available when it is available. And the greater challenge is that this representation of a database that is alphanumeric and this mapping and this cartography should be useful for everyone. And we know that we have a very important bottleneck in decisions. It's interesting to see that one of the first maps that we have seen in records was 3D. And we could see the small houses. These cartographers could see the perspective. I don't know if there was a mountain there or of how they would picture themselves flying, because it comes from the 1500s. How did they have the possibility to have this position? And this is Latin America. If I didn't put here the title saying Caracas, it could be Mexico City, Rio, or any of the 16,000 cities in Latin America. And then we have the competition between formality and formality. Ownership, rights, property rights, titles, registered for real estate as this horizontal property. And well, we go into more legal analysis, because this picture was taken when I was there for a lecture in a conference in land surveying. You can see there, at the left we had the rooms, and at the right we had the conference rooms. What the owner of the hotel charges for this rooms is not the same with this bridge than without it. If you go to the first floor, you cross the street and you go one floor up, then you pay a little less. And if we think about the rights, well, this catwalk or this bridge is taking part of a public space, the street. Materialization of the limit between the public and private would be the facade of the construction of the building. Is this guy paying the municipality for you occupying spaces that is for everyone? So before saying this, I paid my bill, I did my checkout in the hotel to avoid any overcharge. But well, we have the same situation in Ecuador. 1 month ago, we were traveling there, and the owner of this area, of this piece of land, was occupied at the bottom by a public street. So this private property was also eaten by a public area. So the question is, the government contribute to paying that owner for this volume of his property that they occupied? We will continue with the analysis. In Brazil, we have a very common landscape like this in Mexico. You have the settlements down that start to have a reconversion into like horizontal properties or buildings, apartment buildings. So since there's not enough land, the government builds to give this in very small lots, in very small apartments. And this changes the culture. Some people continue to go up on the third story with their horse to pick up the garbage, because this is the way that they've done that. And they can have that in their property. And there's some people that are selling candy in common areas, in an apartment complex. So what is common, what is public, and what is private? That is determined in the space, not only in the projection of, or in the project creation for those blueprints. It seems that we are in ancient times. We are still creating everything in 2D, in 2 dimensions, which is very strong, because when we hire a topographist or someone to conduct a survey, they will measure in 3D, and we ask them to project them. I mean, we're giving them money away. We have the 3D surveys from the beginning, and we throw them away in many cases. These are situations that are more complex. How do you defend the property right inside that building? You go to those apartments, there's one for visits, and you walk in the area. For an engineer, a cartographist or a geologist, it's very easy to determine the spatial coordinates of the vortices. But how do you describe it in a title of property? Well, there's an owner. He's the owner of a volume, not the projections that you may have. It is to continue to evolve in terms of thinking. And now we go to a very common model in Latin America, which is the consistency between the real estate registries and the cadastre. I go to the market, I buy my real estate, and I'm very happy because it says in the yellow it's 10 by 30. When I have the title, they consider the red one. So someone positions the walls or the fences in the wrong way. I know in Mexico this never happens, never. But this happy owner has 3 areas instead of 1. He has one and for which he's the owner because he has the deed, the title deed, but then there's a neighbor who owns the red area, but he's not the owner, and they have this overlapping in orange, considering the area that is taxable, and that should be transferred in the next real estate transaction when being sold. So how do you solve or sort out this confusion in Latin America? Well, it generates a lot of problems. It's very common to have a transfer always of the title deed because in terms of bureaucracy is easier. So we generate this information formally because we don't have the appropriate cadastre that will eliminate this in each transfer, property transfer, or the transfer of land. I can see the preference of God for the next World Cup, the next soccer World Cup. Most of Latin American codes describe property rights as a volume that goes from hell to heaven. According to the civil code, I own cubic meters, and according to the cadastre, I own square meters. So we need to handle this properly. Let's think about this situation. If we follow the logic of the property considering volume, then in Latin America, we can see some buildings like this. And I want to say something. The first conclusions that we draw is when we're talking about 3D cadastre is how to avoid this complex situations. And one of the conclusions was, are we going to cancel all the licenses of architects that generate such complex buildings? Well, the simple the better. So we should cancel the license of all these sophisticated architects. No. But the thing is that we have these urban spaces with property at the top and at the bottom. Someone has to pay for the appropriate taxes because of the use of the space. What is not clear is that people at the top can use some of this space by hanging hammocks, for example, and probably the ones at the bottom can use some other areas for playing soccer or other things. So there's a great controversy, and there's a lot to be defined between the civil codes and the cadastre or the registry. So what we see is that along this volume, there are basically 3 areas. As for the land surface, an area that is close to the surface that is handled by the urban codes. Urban codes tells you how much you can build above that, how many garages you can have at the bottom. And this area, the municipality will manage the construction rights. And from then, we have clear codes in the description of these areas. For us, geographists and cartographers, it's difficult to represent in some cases. Some examples are presented on screen. For example, in Medellin, Colombia, they are already using 3D representations with geographic information systems. In informal areas, there are areas that are occupied that are not property. Each one of them in the informal settlements in Brazil generate rights. And if there is a regulation program, we have to give them title deeds, not for the project of the entire building. And in Bogota, we have a similar case for a PhD study. There was this informal settlement, including all the facades, all the elements, and then they did some planning for the neighborhood using state-of-the-art technology back in 2009, which says that informal settlers are also citizens and they may also use geotechnologies. Not only the rich should use it. I know I have 2 minutes, but when we talk about subsurface or underground services, it's difficult for cartographers. How do we map this? You can use penetration raters, as we've seen in some presentations, that will allow us to define how far the surface will get for a specific mineral or where the water gets, because that's the level where it ends, and there we may have the beginning of the jurisdiction of another water code and other properties owned by the municipality and the appropriate program. So we need to measure them accurately, and we have the technology to do it. And in cities, everything we have said, they're more dynamic than we think. Chile, in the fourth most intense earthquake they had in 2010, so that all the cadastre moved 3 meters in 35 seconds. How do you manage, as a cadastre manager, the movement of all of these plots of land in 35 seconds? And in terms of economy, we will see how this urban economy works, how we map this urban economy in cities so that the cadastre have had its land value through samples of what is on sale. Then we generate a surface of variation by square meter. And from there, we have some detailed analysis to know how much each block will cost. And that's not enough for tax purposes, because these models that are generalized and that are available in Latin America will have another connotation. It's not just to see what the market is absorbing, but it's also to see what urban legislation is giving. We cannot no longer work as technicians, as cartographers, as geographers without an economist and a lawyer next to us. What you see at the right is a physical city. We can map it easily. To the left, you can see the potential of development and construction that has an important impact on the value of each square meter. An empty lot can have a certain price. If you can build a 2-story building, but if you can build a taller building, it will have greater value, even though you haven't built anything yet. You need to consider the impact in those pieces of land. That money goes today to the private sector, instead having one part of it going to the society. And because they are the ones that generate change through the representatives. If we change that, cities would be able to fund themselves more easily. This phrase is very important. Geometries are not geographies, is Milton Santos, an important geometrist in Brazil. Every point, every polygon, and every volume that we draw has to have some associated data. And if they're economic, environmental, it would be better. But the way we have them presented today is not enough for cadastral purposes. This is a person that is selling. Well, he's not selling what he has there, that crap. He's selling the location, and properties are valued through 3 aspects: location, location, and location. That's what we do in a cadastre. We locate and we set a value and a price. Thank you.
We've also included the DENUE, which is the National Statistics Directory of Economic Units, where we incorporate all of the georeferencing of over 4 million economic units. The National Housing Inventory, we have completely georeferenced all of the population with their housing, and the updating that the Housing Institute, which here in Mexico is the Infonavit, it does the updating every year, and we incorporate that into our cartographic database so that we can keep it up to date. So this is the social ownership or social ownership, and this shows the changes in the owners and the different types of properties and things that go from private property to public property and vice versa. No, not vice versa. This is the cadastral information. This is the environmental information that has to do with the census of the municipalities that's conducted every 2 years. We included 2 different modules, one that has to do with water and another that has to do with solid wastes for each of the municipalities, and that's how we get all that information. So we have our response to be able to contribute to land management for the Mexican state and public administration, the states, the municipalities, and that's our tool. This is it's Mexico's digital map. That's where we have all of the information in a user-friendly software that's free, that's easy to use and exploit from home, from the office, from our facilities, so that everyone has access to all of the information produced by the Institute and also all of the information that's generated within the National Statistical and Geographic Information. So I think that's it, but if you have any questions, please feel free. So we thank Rolando Cabos for his wonderful presentation. And we'll now go and start with the question and answer session, which you can ask. We've already received one. So first, we have a question for Diego regarding, well, it's by Enrique Navarro, and regarding as to what countries are already developing or applying the 3D cadastre. Thank you, Hernando, for the presentation, and thank you, Luis. I would ask the technicians to please put up my presentation again so I can give you a link that's very important. Well, before answering the questions, there's something that I forgot to say, and that's why I'm going to take advantage of this. And I think it's important to stress 3 strong concepts. Each presentation always has 2 or 3 strong concepts. The first, don't become obsessed with running out to your municipalities and that you have to change everything and forget about 2D. No. The first idea is Latin America has to identify all of the existing properties, who are the owners, and especially how much are they worth today, and how that value changes dynamically over time in order to be able to finance the cities better. If you organize that, you organize the orthodox cadastre, which we inherited from Europe, we from Spain and Brazil from the Portuguese. And then I think connect the cadastres, that's the second one, with public utilities companies, the Registry of Public Property, all of the players, the INEGI, all of the players who work with land, so that you have a complete geography, and also incorporate informality into the maps. We cannot continue to excluding and ignoring the informality that is so present in the cities. So then we can start thinking about, after that, we can start thinking about the 3D model. And we who go to congresses like this, we always want to hear about the trends. And so we come back concerned because the managers always have the feeling that they are really lagging behind the trends and they're not doing what they have to do and what happens is then they don't do what's obvious. They don't do what they have to do on a day-to-day basis. So we're not trying to discourage academics, but let's give people the time to do what's obvious, what's urgent, and then we'll follow the trends. Okay. So can you put up my slide? Is that my presentation? Okay, so regarding your question, it's on the last slide. Everything that is produced worldwide on cadasters, you're going to find it here at this website, the link to which I'm going to give you. There you go. www.gdmc.nl/3D cadasters, CADASTRES. So we did a pretty exhaustive research on this. There are many initiatives regarding geometry. The urban planners are still talking about industrial areas, restricted areas, central areas. If they started talking about urban spaces instead of areas, the discourse would improve, and that would open the door to having the first serious studies on 3D cadasters with a proper language between economists, engineers, lawyers, managers, and just mere mortals. We also have a question by Victoria Eugenia Pauret relative to what are the reference systems or technical data that you can give that are available to implement a cadastre project. That's a very good question. Well, in America, we have CIGMA for implementing 3D. Now, what is the reference surface area? Okay, we've already resolved the problem of planimetry because the cadasters have the paradigm of bidimensional coordinates to define properties. If we talk about 3D, what is a reference surface area? What are we going to do? Have a plan, an arbitrary plan for a city? Well, that's alternative number one. Are we going to use an ellipsoid, or are we going to use a geoid to measure the city? So these are unanswered questions that are important, and there are all sorts of initiatives. Depending on the structure, even of the geologic structure of the city, if it were simplified, a reference plan for all of the objectives and for horizontal condominiums, etc., that would be enough. But if it's a megalopolis like the Mexico City and it's complex in terms of hydraulics, the environment, the subsoil, etc., then a geoidal model is the most appropriate thing. But what Latin American city has a properly measured geoidal? So let's think about ellipsoid instead. Thank you, Diego. Luis Enrique Mendez wants to ask you a question. What are the best practices for solving the problems that occur between the differences that has to do with the documented property and the physical property? Thank you very much. Look, best practices sounds to me like international banking jargon. They want to, look, I'm not against it. They want to disseminate. We work with the trends. But the best practices doesn't mean that they are good for everyone. Sometimes you use that term to sell something that's already worked somewhere else. So planners transfer urban planning from one city to another, and they just change the name. I wouldn't be a generalist. I would say, look, the best practice is, it depends on the creativity of the technicians who know the city better than anyone else. The consultants, they arrive like in parachutes and they know it a little bit, but nobody knows that better than you. And somebody mentioned at one of the conferences participative planning by having conversations with society. And here you will find answers for structuring the information and keeping it up to date. Now, specifically, in answer to this, there is a model that works very well in streamlining the title deeds with each transfer, and this is the one that Argentina and Uruguay use, and that they demand a cadastral certificate every time you transfer title. And this certificate is a product of a map that is made by a land surveyor, that he goes to the property and he detects the differences. So the notary public then, when the cadaster generates a certificate that describes the new dimensions of the property or of the real estate and not the previous dimensions or measurements. So what has happened is that because in the last 200 years, which is where the oldest cadaster, the date of the oldest cadaster in Latin America, so there's a level of trust. That way there can be a level of trust in what the paper actually says. Okay, so thank you very much. If we have no more questions for our speakers, well then I only have to thank all of you for being here. And to Diego and Rolando, and who we're going to give these tokens of recognition by the INEGI for their participation in this Congress. Thank you, Diego. And thank you, Rolando. And that is it.